Just a nurse. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 47 minutes before Commander Marcus Hayes coded for the third time. Cedar Creek Medical's ICU hums with fluorescent lights casting green shadows across sterile floors that smell of antiseptic and recycled air. Brooke Sullivan moves between monitors with invisible efficiency, her scrubs faded from 3 years of night shifts, a woman who exists in peripheral vision. She logs vitals with steady hands despite the tremor that surfaces only when she touches cold metal, a tactile memory she's trained herself to suppress. Her badge hangs on a lanyard beside a small silver pin, both items she learned long ago to keep unremarkable, unnoticed. On her desk sits a pair of worn combat boots she keeps as a paperweight, scuffed leather that patients assume belong to her son. The boots are from Helmand Province, 2015, though nobody at Cedar Creek Medical knows that. The ER intercom crackles at 18:43 hours. Incoming trauma. 38-year-old male, multi-organ failure, toxic exposure incident. Commander Marcus Hayes, classified background, Navy liaison coordination required. The voice is flat, clinical, but Brooke's hand still for exactly 2 seconds. She has not heard that name spoken aloud in 7 years. She places her pen down with the same precision she uses to insert a central line, no rush, no hesitation, all muscle memory. The admitting nurses around her move into automatic positions, checking bed capacity, pulling crash cart supplies, running through the mental checklist that every ICU nurse maintains like a weapon system. Brooke walks toward the incoming bay with the same measured pace she uses everywhere, nothing changed in her expression, nothing visible in her breathing. But her left hand touches the combat boots as she passes her desk. Just for a half second. Just long enough. When Hayes arrives, he is gone. That is what strikes her first. The man she knew commanded a room with his presence alone, the kind of authority that makes the air pressure change around him. Now he is a body on a gurney, his skin the color of old concrete, his chest rising in shallow mechanical breaths courtesy of the paramedic's intubation tube. His vitals are a nightmare written in red numbers across the monitor. BP 68/42. Heart rate 127. O2 sat 91 and dropping. Core temperature 33.8. The triage doctor rattles off the exposure details with the tone of someone reading from a manual. Unidentified chemical compound. Suspected organophosphate class agent. Exposure duration unknown. 13 hours post-exposure. Full decontamination protocol completed at National Guard facility. Command authorization for extended ICU hold, no discharge threshold. Nobody in the trauma bay looks at her. Nobody ever does. Brooke assists with the transfer to Bed 7, the critical care position by the window where the monitoring is tightest and the staff rotation heaviest. She checks the 4 ports, 2 18-gauge lines already running lactated ringers, normal saline dripping, medications queued for immediate delivery. Her fingers move with the automatic grace of someone who has done this 10,000 times. She pulls his chart, cross-references the blood work, studies the numbers like they are written in a language only she can read. Troponin elevated at 2.4. Creatinine 1.8 and climbing. Liver enzymes through the roof. Acetylcholinesterase at 15% of normal, and that is the key. That is the story the blood is telling. Organophosphate compounds lock that enzyme, paralyze the parasympathetic nervous system, leave the body drowning in its own secretions. She has seen this before. She has treated this before. She has watched men die from this before, in compounds that no longer officially exist, with medical supplies scavenged from field kits designed for 12 people treating 90 casualties. But she says nothing. She logs the vitals. She adjusts the flow. She checks the monitor's electrode placement on his chest. She does all of this with her face showing exactly what a nurse shows: concern, competence, the blank slate of professional responsibility. Her son's commanding officer lies in Bed 7 with his organs failing in real time, and she nods to the admitting resident and walks back to her station to begin the documentation. The chart needs chelation protocol notes. The blood work needs cross-reference against the toxicology panels. The medication sequence needs to be recorded for the attending physician's review. She begins typing, and her fingers move at the exact speed they always move, not fast, not slow, nothing that would draw attention. Nothing that would suggest this patient is anything other than another critical admission on another night shift. Dr. Whitfield arrives for evening grand rounds at 19:27 hours, flanked by 8 residents in formation like a general inspecting troops. He is 62 years old, head of ICU operations for 7 years, a man whose white coat is pressed sharp enough to cut and whose silver hair looks like it was styled specifically to photograph well in donor materials. He wears a Rolex that probably cost more than Brooke's car. He walks with the kind of stride that expects people to move, and people do. Brooke continues charting. She does not look up. She knows what is coming because it has come every time she has suggested anything beyond the most basic nursing observations in this department. The residents are already smirking. They always start smirking before Whitfield speaks. Bed 7. His voice carries the tone of a man announcing something contemptible. I'm seeing some interesting notes here. Chelation protocol suggestion. Specific enzyme replacement recommendations. He holds up her patient notes, the paper fluttering slightly in his hand like evidence of a crime. Any of our residents care to explain why a floor nurse thinks she should be designing pharmaceutical interventions? The silence that follows is the sound of 8 medical school graduates discovering which way the wind blows in this unit. One resident laughs, a short bark of a thing that gets louder when the others join in. Whitfield's smile widens. He is a man who understands institutional power the way composers understand music. He knows how to conduct it, direct it, use it to make other people feel small. Brooke's pen stops moving. That is all. Her hand does not tremble. Her face does not flush. She simply stops typing and sits motionless in her chair for exactly 3 seconds. When she begins again, her fingers move at the same pace as before. The monitor beside her beeps twice, Hayes's heart rate spiking to 131, and she glances at the waveform, notes the rhythm, makes a mental note to check his central line placement. Her jaw clamps tight. Her jaw is a line of absolute precision, the kind of thing that people who know how to read bodies would recognize as the opposite of weakness. It is the appearance of something held under control. But Whitfield is not looking at her anymore. He is looking at his residents. The thing is, he continues, his voice settling into the confident tone of a man who has already won the argument, nursing intuition is valuable. In its place. When that place is patient comfort, hygiene, basic monitoring. Not when it ventures into medical decision-making. He sets her chart down on the nearest workstation, and the gesture is careful, deliberate, a man placing something contaminated into a designated biohazard container. We have physicians for that. People with medical degrees. People who have studied pharmacology and toxicology and pathophysiology. Not people with certification programs. The residents nod. One of them actually takes a note. Whitfield's smile suggests he finds this gratifying. So, moving forward, let's keep our notes to vital signs and fluid balance. Leave the advanced thinking to the team with credentials. The grand rounds continue. Bed 8, a 64-year-old woman with septic shock, receives 2 minutes of clinical discussion. Bed 9, a 31-year-old post-op cardiac patient, gets 3 minutes and 2 medication adjustments. Bed 7 gets a cursory vitals review and a statement about maintaining current protocol without modification. Whitfield does not look at Brooke again. He does not need to. The message has been delivered in front of 8 witnesses and the entire nursing staff. He has made her visible, which is worse than being invisible, because visibility comes with the weight of public humiliation. But that was not the worst part. 20 minutes later, when she is pulling her lunch break and walking toward the staff cafeteria, she hears Whitfield's voice coming from the vending machine alcove. He is with 2 residents, and he is speaking in a tone just loud enough to carry down the hallway, loud enough that anyone within 30 feet would hear it. The concerning part about that whole chelation suggestion is the confidence. You know? She genuinely seems to think she understands what an organophosphate exposure requires. When in reality, she's just a nurse who's read one too many medical websites. The laughter that follows is not mean exactly. It is the laughter of people who have permission to be dismissive, and she hears every second of it even though she has stopped walking and turned her face toward the water fountain to make it look like she is getting a drink. Her hand grips the water fountain button. Just that. Nothing else changes. Her breathing stays level. Her face stays blank. Her other hand stays at her side, palm flat against her leg, muscles locked in position. She counts to 6, releases the button, stands up straight, turns around, and walks back toward the ICU. The residents scatter when they see her coming. Whitfield watches her pass with an expression that suggests he finds her composure either amusing or irrelevant. She does not look at him. She looks at the monitor in bed 7, at Commander Marcus Hayes' failing body, at the chemistry of toxins that has locked down his nervous system, at the numbers that are telling a story only certain people can read. She sits at her desk and opens the chelation protocol file again. She reads through the evidence, studies from medical journals, research on acetylcholinesterase replacement, data on organophosphate class exposures from military medical archives she absolutely should not have access to but does. She reads her own notes, the recommendations she made based on field experience she cannot mention and treatment successes she cannot document, and a decade of medical training that exists in classified files and oral histories, and the muscle memory of hands that have done this work in circumstances that no longer officially exist. Then she closes the file. She logs out. She stands up and walks to bed 7, checks the 4 line, adjusts the rate on the normal saline infusion, and reviews the medication queue for the evening. Hayes' eyes are closed. His face is the color of stone. His respirations are mechanical, ventilator-driven, shallow, the kind of breathing that keeps you alive without making you feel alive. She reaches out and touches his hand, just for a second, just a brush of skin against skin. Her fingers, steady as a surgical laser, rest on his pulse point. His heartbeat is there, fast and erratic, a rhythm that speaks of a body at war with itself. She thinks about her son. She thinks about the letters she never sent, the phone calls she never made, the 14-year-old kid she left with her ex-wife, and a cover story because some operations required more than the death of a career. Some operations required the death of a person. Hayes' monitors continue their electronic chorus. The fluorescent lights hum overhead like something alive. And in the vending machine alcove 30 feet away, Dr. Whitfield's laughter fades as his residents scatter back to their assigned rounds, none of them aware that they are standing in the presence of someone whose qualifications existed in a world they could not access, whose authority came from a system that had spent 15 years teaching her that saving lives was the only thing that mattered, regardless of the cost. She pulls his chart again. She begins to write new notes, more detailed this time, observations about his enzyme levels that only someone with very specific training would notice, suggestions about treatment protocols that sound like the work of a dedicated floor nurse and nothing more. She documents everything. She catalogs everything. She prepares everything that will be needed for the moment when command chains outside this hospital find out that Commander Marcus Hayes is in San Antonio and in critical condition. And she does all of this with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Because she had. 7 years ago. The vending machine hummed its fluorescent song at 1,447 hours when Whitfield's voice found her like shrapnel. Brooke had inserted $2 bills, watching them feed through the mechanical slot with the same detached precision she used to catalog vital signs. The coffee she didn't want was secondary to the silence she needed, 15 minutes away from Hayes' bed, away from monitors, away from the weight of knowing exactly what was coming and being powerless to stop it. "Did you see Nurse Google's face?" His voice carried down the hallway like artillery fire in a confined space, loud enough to reach the pharmacy door, loud enough to reach her ears. Loud on purpose. I think she actually believed we'd take her seriously. A resident's laugh. Nervous. The kind of laugh that comes when someone is testing whether the joke lands before committing fully. Brooke watched her coffee cup drop into the tray. It was still steaming. She didn't retrieve it. What was she even suggesting? Another voice. Younger. Medical school arrogance still sharp, not yet worn smooth by reality. Whitfield's response came with the cadence of a man performing for an audience. DMPS with glutathione support. Like she's running a field hospital in Afghanistan. He laughed. The residents joined him. His voice moved higher, mocking, painting syllables in colors they shouldn't have. I mean, where do these nurses get these ideas? WEBMD? Reddit? The desperation is almost tragic. Brooke stood motionless at the vending machine. She could have walked. Should have walked. Her training screamed at her to leave, to blend, to become invisible in the way she'd mastered over 15 years of being invisible. Instead, she inserted another dollar bill into the slot. Deliberate. Measured. Her hands were perfectly steady. That was the thing about field hospitals and firefights and watching men die from decisions made by people who didn't understand the chemistry of their own ignorance. Your hands learned to stop shaking. The trembling would come later. Not here. Never here. She actually cited studies. One of the older residents. Defensive. 3 peer-reviewed journals on chelation protocols for organophosphate exposure. Whitfield's voice dropped, which was somehow worse than when it was loud. A tank idling in a garage, all that power held in reserve. And that confidence is exactly what makes her dangerous. A little knowledge, no context, and suddenly she thinks she's a toxicologist. A pause. She could hear him turning. The worst nurses are the ones who read too much. They get ideas about their role. They forget hierarchy. They forget that some people have spent years, actual years, earning the right to make decisions in crisis. The vending machine clicked. Her coffee dropped. She left it there. The hallway between the vending machines and the ICU was 47 feet long. She knew because she'd counted it during her first week at Cedar Creek, mapping exits and approaches the way her muscle memory insisted she do for every environment. 2 fire extinguishers, 1 crash cart on wheels, 3 cameras angled to cover the intersections. 7 doors that opened into monitored spaces. 1 stairwell that didn't show up on the standard floor plan. Her jaw was a tight line. Not from anger. Anger was a luxury she'd stopped being able to afford when she was 23 years old. The tightness was containment. It was the mechanism that kept everything she actually was from leaking out through her eyes and voice and the way her hands moved. It was the scar tissue she'd grown over the parts of herself that had learned to calculate trajectories and lead targets and read ground and trust nothing except her training and the Marines who bled the same color she did. She passed Whitfield's cluster in the hallway without looking at them. Her peripheral vision caught movement, his head turning, his eyes finding her with the satisfaction of a hunter watching prey register that it had been spotted. She didn't react. Reaction was information. She kept walking, her pace unchanged, her face the professional blankness she'd perfected 3 years ago when she'd chosen a fake name and worn scrubs to disappear. At Hayes's bedside, the monitors sang their mechanical chorus. Oxygen saturation 91% and holding steady. Blood pressure 115/72. Heart rate 84. The numbers felt wrong because they were wrong. She'd seen this pattern before in Helmand Province, in a casualty care facility with concrete floors and no running water, in the body of a sergeant first class who'd been exposed to something the military still wouldn't name. The tests would show what everyone expected. The patient would deteriorate in the predicted pattern. And by day 4, the organ systems would begin the cascade that everyone could see coming and nobody would have the authority to stop. Except she did have authority. She had something deeper than authority. She had 15 years of field medicine and tactical care and the knowledge that this specific commander, this man lying unconscious with 4 lines taped to his forearms, had written her son's name on a casualty report 6 years ago with 3 words, kept him alive. 2 hours later, at 1,631 hours, Brooke approached the attending physician, Dr. Morrison, a woman in her 50s who actually listened, and held out 3 printed research papers, sections highlighted in yellow. "Sir, I'd like to discuss the chelation protocol for organophosphate toxicity. The literature suggests." Ms. Sullivan. Whitfield appeared as if he'd been waiting for her to make this exact move. Because he had. This was the trap, the provocation designed to give him documentation. His voice was quiet. Controlled. A knife instead of a club. If you continue practicing medicine without a license, I will have security escort you out of this hospital. Do you understand? Out. Not reassigned. Not counseled. Out. His finger pointed toward the exit like an accusation. Around them, the floor moved in that strange way hospitals move when conflict emerges, everyone suddenly very focused on their work, nobody looking at the confrontation, everyone hearing every word. Brooke met his eyes. She saw the infrastructure of power behind them, 3 board members on speed dial, a network of attending physicians who deferred to his seniority, the kind of institutional authority that came from having the right credentials and the confidence to weaponize them. She saw a man who had never been questioned by someone who didn't care about consequences because they'd already lost everything worth keeping. "Yes, doctor," she said. Not "yes, sir." Not apologetic. Just factual. The words of someone complying with an order while simultaneously documenting that the order had been given and was being obeyed under duress. She turned and returned to Hayes's bedside. Her hand shook slightly when she reached for the 4-pole, not from fear, but from the weight of containment. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was 15 years of muscle memory and protocol and the discipline that had kept her breathing in caves and compounds and places that no longer appeared on maps. It was the resistance of everything she actually was, pressed down into the shape of a hospital nurse who took orders and asked no questions and wore her invisibility like armor. That evening, at 1847 hours, after the shift rotation and after Whitfield left the ICU floor, Brooke retreated to the supply closet on the east wing. The fluorescent lights here hummed with a slightly different frequency. She'd noticed that on day 3 of working at Cedar Creek. Everything in a hospital had its own rhythm if you listened long enough. The ventilators had one frequency. The cardiac monitors had another. The medication dispensers had a third. Even the supply closet lights sang their specific note, and she moved between them like a musician reading a familiar score. She pressed her forehead against the cold metal shelving. The texture was rough under her skin, textured by years of being wiped down with antiseptic. Behind her, the door closed softly. Nobody locked supply closets. There was no point. The staff knew not to disturb anyone they found in one alone because people went to supply closets for the same reason they went anywhere private, to fall apart, to cry, to remember why they'd chosen a job that asked them to hold other people's emergencies while their own remained locked inside their chests. 30 seconds. That was her allowance. That was the luxury she granted herself, 30 seconds to let her shoulders drop, to let the tightness in her jaw loosen, to let the trembling move through her hands and arms like electricity seeking ground. The metal shelf was cold. Familiar. In some ways it felt safer than anything in her current life because it was honest. It didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. It was just metal, just a surface, just a physical object that had never learned to smile or lie or explain itself in words that meant something different than what they said. 20 seconds remaining. She could see Hayes's chart in her mind, not the version Whitfield was writing but the one she was maintaining, the one that documented everything the attending physicians were missing because they weren't trained to see it. Organophosphate compounds didn't follow the standard cascade. They followed a pattern that required someone who'd worked in field medicine, someone who'd intubated casualties without proper ventilation equipment, someone who'd held a line against chemical exposure while calling coordinates for support that wouldn't arrive in time. Someone exactly like her. The problem was that someone like her wasn't supposed to exist in a place like Cedar Creek Medical. Someone like her was supposed to be erased, buried under a manufactured identity, locked into a career path that asked nothing but obedience and the ability to follow protocols written by people who'd never had to make life-and-death decisions with nothing but their hands and their training and their refusal to accept that they couldn't save someone. 10 seconds remaining. She pushed off from the shelf and straightened her spine. Her hand steadied. Her jaw retightened. The nurse who had come into this supply closet picked up her badge and returned to being exactly what everyone expected, competent, deferential, invisible, and absolutely harmless. but the woman who pressed her forehead against cold metal shelving and allowed herself 30 seconds to shake was someone else entirely. She was someone who had made a promise 6 years ago to a sergeant who'd bled onto a concrete floor. She was someone who had already died once in a cave system near Kandahar, whose records had been erased, whose name had been removed from a roster that officially never existed. She was someone who didn't have anything left to lose. At 2,240 hours that night, as the monitors began their warning cascade and Brooke watched Hayes's organ systems start their descent, she would remember standing in that supply closet. She would remember the cold metal. She would remember that Whitfield's threat had been documented. She would remember that she'd complied with his order to stop practicing medicine without a license, and she would remember that she had absolutely no intention of following it. She would also remember, as she moved toward a decision that would cost her everything, that some promises were stronger than hospitals. Some obligations transcended ranks and credentials and institutional power. Some things mattered more than keeping the job she didn't actually need, because the only job she'd ever actually had was the one that lived in her hands and her training and the muscle memory of a Master Chief Petty Officer who had learned a long time ago what it meant to save someone's life, even when it cost her own. The monitors told her everything at 2,240 hours. Urine output 0. Creatinine climbing. Liver enzymes spiking like a fever chart from hell. Brooke stood at the bedside of Commander Marcus Hayes, her eyes moving across the vital signs with the precision of someone reading a battlefield casualty report, which was exactly what this was. The organophosphate toxin was saturation critical now. She'd seen this pattern before, not in a textbook, not in a simulation, but in a field hospital 30 kilometers outside Kandahar, where a Marine had absorbed nerve agent through a tear in his hazmat suit and his organs had begun their systematic shutdown like a building losing floors in a controlled demolition. Hayes's liver was failing. His kidneys were failing. His blood was becoming a reservoir for a poison that had no antidote, only time and intervention and the kind of medical aggression that made hospital administrators nervous. She checked the 4 access point, still patent, still good. The chelation protocol she'd suggested wasn't in any civilian textbook because it wasn't designed for civilian medicine. It was designed for soldiers exposed to classified chemical agents in places that didn't officially exist. She moved to the supply cart without permission, without announcement. Habit. Military discipline. The kind of efficiency that came from knowing that hesitation killed people. She gathered a 14-gauge angiocath, calibrated the additional monitoring equipment that no resident had thought to order, and began the preparations for what was coming. Not if. When. The pattern was mathematical. The saturation curve was predictable. In approximately 7 hours, Commander Marcus Hayes's heart would stop. The night shift had begun at 1900 hours, skeleton crew, 3 residents rotating through 12-hour blocks, one overworked attending named Dr. Chen who'd been at Cedar Creek for 6 months and still looked surprised every time a patient deteriorated. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant antiseptic hum above Hayes's bed. Monitors beeped in their measured rhythm. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical breath, keeping oxygen flowing into lungs that were becoming less capable of processing it by the hour. Brooke had worked 56 consecutive hours with only the bathroom break she stole between codes. Her hands were steady. Her mind was running 3 moves ahead. At 02 for 7 hours, Hayes's heart stopped. The monitor flatlined. No sound from the mechanical breath. Just the absence of it, that terrible silence that came when the body decided it was finished fighting. Brooke's eyes were on the monitor when it happened. She'd known it was coming. The body doesn't lie. The numbers don't lie. She'd been checking the washout every 90 minutes, watching the toxin load climb despite everything, watching the organ failure accelerate like a descent that gravity makes inevitable. She pressed the call button. Not a request. A statement. Her hand was already moving to Hayes's chest, already positioning for the compressions that would begin in seconds. The night residents came first, 2 third-year residents named Morrison and Kim, both competent, both exhausted, both moving like people who'd already brought 3 patients back from codes tonight and were running on coffee and adrenaline and the particular despair that comes from losing count of how many times you've pushed on a stranger's ribs hoping their heart would remember how to beat. Dr. Chen arrived 45 seconds later, moving slower, assessing faster. He was the kind of physician who made good decisions under pressure because he'd learned not to panic. He didn't know Brooke. He read her badge and saw a floor nurse assisting with compressions, performing them with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done this maybe 1,700 times before, her hands positioned at exactly the right angle, her compressions at exactly 100 beats per minute, not the recommended 110, not the panicked 140 that killed people. 100. The perfect rhythm. Epinephrine pushed through the 1 milligram. The classic dose. Brooke called it without being asked, epi-in. Her voice was flat, informational, the voice of someone reporting data, not emotion. Kim bagged oxygen. Morrison kept compressions on the second round while Brooke moved to monitor the access points. The rotor wash of a distant helicopter moved across the city somewhere, not for Hayes, just background rhythm of a San Antonio night, but it made everything feel more urgent somehow. 18 minutes of compressions. 18 minutes of rhythmic violence meant to save a life. Brooke watched the monitor between breaths, watching for the electrical activity that would mean Hayes's heart was remembering how to fire. Asystole. Flat line. The worst rhythm, the one that almost never came back. Then it did. The monitor showed a blip. Then a rhythm. Then sinus rhythm like a light switching on. Hayes's heart came back to life, the electrical impulses firing in the correct sequence, the ventricles contracting, blood pushing through arteries that had been still just moments before. The residents looked at each other with the exhausted relief of people who'd won the unwinnable bet. Dr. Chen nodded once. Clipped orders for medications, for labs, for a chest film to rule out rib fractures from the compressions. Brooke stepped back. Made room. Documented everything with the obsessive precision of someone trained to make reports that would mean the difference between a soldier's discharge and his court-martial, between an operation being classified and an operation being prosecuted. The metadata mattered. The exact timing mattered. The exact medications and doses mattered. Hayes stayed stable for 63 minutes. His oxygen saturation held at 92%. His blood pressure was weak, 80/40, but it was circulating. The toxin load on his next washout had actually decreased, the chelation protocol beginning to work, the heavy metal chelators binding to the organophosphate compounds and preparing them for excretion. It was working. Brooke could see it in the chemistry, could feel it in the way the monitors had stopped screaming. Then at 0310 hours, his heart stopped again. This time it was faster. The residents responded faster because they knew what to come back from. Compressions, medications, the steady pushing and breathing and hoping that characterized the violence of saving a life. 12 minutes this time. Maybe less. Hayes came back again, his rhythm returning like a light flickering on and off, unstable but present. Dr. Chen adjusted the medications, ordered more labs, looked at Brooke across the bed with the expression of someone calculating odds they didn't like. Brooke's jaw tightened. Just barely. The smallest movement. Her hands remained steady as she documented vital signs that showed an organ system in collapse, a body running out of time, a situation accelerating toward something inevitable. Dr. Whitfield arrived at 0330 hours, called by Dr. Chen, and the temperature in the ICU changed. Not lowered. Changed. The air pressure altered. A presence entered the space like a cold front moving through a valley, inevitable, inescapable, carrying with it the weight of hierarchical authority and the particular arrogance of a man who'd built his career on knowing everyone's weaknesses and using them like instruments. He assessed Hayes in 30 seconds. Eyes on the monitor, eyes on the labs Dr. Chen was holding, eyes on the ventilator, eyes on the 4 lines, eyes on Brooke herself for a moment that lasted long enough to feel like assessment. Then he turned to Dr. Chen with the calm of someone who'd already made decisions. Resuscitation failure is predictable, Whitfield said. His voice carried the measured cadence of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow. Organ cascade. Toxin saturation. He gestured at the monitor with the fluid movement of a conductor. When he codes again, and he will, we stop. No heroics. No extended resuscitation. Chart it as DNR after consultation with the family. Do you understand? Dr. Chen looked uncomfortable. Uncomfortable in the way of physicians who knew what the right medical decision was and also knew what the institutional decision was, and they weren't the same thing. He nodded anyway. I'll need to contact the next of kin. I'll do it, Whitfield said. He pulled a pen from his coat pocket and began writing on Hayes's chart with the confident strokes of someone absolutely certain his decisions would stand. Family conference at 0700. We tell them what they need to hear, that we've done everything, that further intervention is futile, that letting him go with dignity is the compassionate choice. He tore the order sheet from the chart and handed it to Dr. Chen. Then he turned to Brooke, and his eyes had that look, the look she'd learned to recognize in Afghanistan, the look on the faces of officers who'd decided someone was expendable, who'd already written the casualty report in their minds and moved on. You're reassigned, Whitfield said. Effective immediately. The orthopedic floor. Night shift. You'll report to Charge Nurse Peterson, and you'll remain on that floor. You're too emotionally invested in this patient. Too close. It affects your judgment. He handed her a printed sheet, the reassignment order, already authorized, already finalized. His signature on it. Not a consultation. A command. Understood, Doctor, Brooke said. Her voice was even. Flat. The voice of someone accepting orders in a language that wasn't quite English anymore, the language of military compliance, the language she'd learned to speak in places where disagreeing could get people killed. Whitfield pulled Dr. Chen aside, and Brooke heard the fragment's low voice, but not low enough, that nurse keeps pushing this unsustainable protocol, boundary violations, remove her before she does damage. Dr. Chen looked at Brooke, and she could see the sympathy in his face, could see him calculating whether saying something would help or just make it worse. She turned toward the door. Accepted the order. Began the walk toward the orthopedic floor and a job that wasn't her job because the only job that was ever really hers had been the one that lived in her hands and in the muscle memory of a Master Chief Petty Officer who could read vital signs the way most people read books. But that wasn't the worst part. At 0302 hours, 3 minutes before she reached the stairwell, 3 minutes before she could begin leaving, Hayes's heart stopped for the third time. The monitor screamed. Not metaphorically. Actually screamed. The alarm chirped in that particular urgent rhythm that meant cardiac arrest, that meant a life in the balance, that meant everything stopped for the possibility of saving one person. Brooke's body moved toward the ICU without her conscious decision to do so. Muscle memory. The response of a nervous system trained in places where you didn't ask permission to save lives, you just did it. Morrison and Kim were already running compressions, their faces showing the exhaustion of people who'd already revived this patient twice in 3 hours and were running out of hope to fuel the effort. Dr. Chen was adjusting medications. Epinephrine pushed again. The familiar violence of resuscitation. Whitfield stood at the monitor, watching, his expression clinical and final. The look of a surgeon observing an autopsy, a man already composing the death note in his mind. How long? Whitfield asked. 8 minutes so far, Morrison said between compressions. Sweat on his forehead. The particular desperation of residents who'd been trained to save everyone but were learning the hard way that you couldn't. Stop, Whitfield said at 12 minutes. His voice had the weight of authority, the finality of someone who'd already calculated odds and found them untenable. Time of death, he glanced at the clock. But Brooke was moving. She was inside the ICU before the words finished forming in the air. She could feel Dr. Chen's eyes on her, could feel Morrison and Kim hesitating because they recognized something in her movement, not the movement of a floor nurse, but the movement of someone with rank they didn't understand and authority they couldn't articulate but could definitely sense. She took over compressions from Morrison. Her hands on Hayes's chest. Her rhythm perfect. 100 beats per minute. Her eyes on the monitor. Her mind running calculations, chelation protocol status, organ washout trends, medication response patterns. Everything said he should be dead. Everything clinical said Whitfield was right. Everything except the part of her that had held dying soldiers together with bandages and willpower in places where there weren't enough resources to go around, but you gave them anyway because that's what you did. And then she reached for the master key on her badge, the one every floor nurse carried, the one that opened medication carts and supply rooms and, with the right technique, secured doors from the inside. Her hand was steady. Her mind was clear. She knew exactly what she was about to do and exactly how much it would cost, and she was going to do it anyway because some things mattered more than keeping jobs you didn't actually need. She continued compressions with her left hand, her right hand moving to the ICU door with the casual confidence of someone simply securing the work area, and her fingers found the lock mechanism. One motion. Smooth. Practiced. The door locked from the inside with a soft, decisive click that nobody heard over the urgency of compressions and medications and the monitor's insistent alarm. She looked at Dr. Chen across the bed. She looked at Whitfield at the monitor. She looked at Morrison and Kim and said something that came out in a voice neither of them had heard from her before, low, calm, carrying the weight of command authority that had no source in any hospital hierarchy. Get me 100 milligrams of succinylcholine for RSI. And push another epi. We're not done here. It wasn't a request. It was a command. And for the first time since arriving at Cedar Creek Medical, Brooke Sullivan stopped being invisible. The third code blue came at 0300 hours like a clock strike nobody wanted to hear. Commander Hayes's heart had stopped again, not the stuttering, hesitant kind that comes with failure. The full stop. The flat line that sang its one long note through the monitor like a siren nobody could silence. The surgical team had been fighting for 18 hours. Exhaustion hung over them like smoke. Dr. Whitfield stood at the foot of the bed, his shoulders already turning toward the door, already composing the language of futility in his head. He looked at the resident beside him, a young woman whose hands were shaking. Time of death, 0303 hours, he said, his voice carrying the weight of finality, of doors closing. We're done here. Call it. Brooke was already moving. She didn't ask permission. She didn't hesitate or check protocols or look for authorization. Her hand found the crash cart in 3 strides, muscle memory moving faster than thought, her fingers finding the number 10 scalpel in the tray with the certainty of someone who had done this before in places where hesitation meant death. The resident tried to block her. You can't, the attending said. Brooke's voice came out flat, stripped of every courtesy she'd practiced for 3 years. Step back. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command delivered with the tone of someone who had given orders under mortar fire, and the resident moved, her body recognizing authority before her mind could argue. Brooke's hands entered Hayes's chest cavity between the 5th and 6th ribs in a motion so practiced it looked choreographed. The scalpel cut through skin, then muscle, then the tough membranous sac of the pericardium. Blood spilled but not chaos, controlled bleeding, efficient bleeding, the bleeding of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. She reached in, found Hayes's heart, and her fingers closed around it like she was holding something precious and fragile and absolutely critical to keep breathing. Direct cardiac massage. Manual resuscitation. The oldest procedure in emergency medicine, rarely performed, never performed by nurses, certainly never performed with this precision, her hands moving in a rhythm that was almost meditative if meditative could exist in the space between life and death. Epinephrine, 1 milligram, for push. Now, she said, and her voice had changed completely. The timid nurse from the vending machine was gone. In her place stood someone whose authority needed no explanation, needed no credential verification. Calcium chloride, 1 gram over 2 minutes. And get me the internal defibrillator paddles. The resident hesitated for half a second too long. Brooke's eyes found hers without lifting her hands from Hayes's chest. I said get me the internal paddles or this man dies. Choose now. The resident chose. She moved like someone following orders in a combat zone, because that's what Brooke's presence had transformed the ICU into, a bunker, a field hospital, a place where the normal rules of hierarchy didn't apply anymore because there was someone in the room who had already practiced this dance in Helmand Province, who had compressed a heart under chemical fire, Who had kept men breathing when everything in a military bunker was designed to prevent that exact outcome? Whitfield moved toward her, his face the color of old concrete. "Sullivan, step away from that patient immediately. You are not authorized," but Brooke was already pushing the internal paddles through the open chest cavity, positioning them around Hayes's ventricles, and she was already calling out numbers without looking up. "Charge to 20 joules. Clear." The electricity moved through Hayes's heart like lightning, finding its target. His body didn't jerk, he was already open, already exposed to the full extent of a thoracotomy, the brutal math of keeping a man alive by hand. The monitor showed nothing but green chaos for 2 seconds. 3 seconds. 4. Then a blip. A single electrical spike. Then another. Then a rhythm. Not perfect, not stable yet, but rhythm. Sinus rhythm. The sound the monitor made was the sound of something that had been dead deciding, inexplicably, to live again. Brooke's hands kept moving, kept massaging, kept that heart pumping through 7 minutes of compressions while medications moved through 4 lines and the resident called out vital signs that were climbing instead of falling. 80 millimeters of mercury. 90. Oxygen saturation at 88% and rising. The monitors that had been screaming 5 minutes ago were now singing something closer to hope. Hayes's eyes flickered. Once. Twice. His fingers moved. His breathing, still shallow but present, began trying to synchronize with the ventilator instead of fighting it. Brooke maintained the compressions for another minute, then 2, watching the numbers climb, watching the color return to Hayes's face from the grayish-white of the freshly dead to something that looked like it might survive. She looked at the resident without expression. "Prepare the suture kit." "I'm closing." The stitches she placed in the thoracotomy incision were the kind of stitches that belonged in textbooks or surgical demonstrations, not in emergency medicine performed by a nurse without authorization or credentials beyond what a floor nurse was supposed to possess. Each one was perfectly spaced, perfectly tensioned, the kind of closure that would heal cleanly, that would leave scars telling a story to any trauma surgeon who knew how to read them. The resident watched and didn't speak because there was nothing to say. What she was witnessing couldn't be explained by a nursing degree from a state university. What she was witnessing was someone stepping completely out of a manufactured identity and into something that had been buried but never quite dead. Brooke stepped back. Hayes's monitors showed stable rhythms. His blood pressure had climbed to 110/62. His oxygen saturation held at 92%. She turned to unlock the ICU door, her hands moving toward the keypad with the same steadiness they'd shown while compressing a commander's heart, and that's when she saw him. Dr. Whitfield was standing in the doorway, his phone already in his hand, his expression the satisfied look of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment, who had been documenting it, who was already calculating how to transform rescue into career destruction. "Miss Sullivan," he said, and his voice carried a smile that his face wasn't making yet. "That was an impressive performance. Really quite remarkable. You're also immediately terminated." He held up his phone. "I've made calls to 3 board members. Called the state nursing board with a formal complaint of unauthorized practice. The Texas Medical Board will have documentation by dawn." He stepped fully into the ICU, and now his face completed the smile, the look of someone who had just used a scalpel of his own, just not on Hayes. "You violated at least 12 protocols. Unauthorized emergency procedures. Falsified documentation. Practicing medicine without a license. These are criminal matters, Ms. Sullivan, not hospital matters. I've already contacted the district attorney's office." Brooke didn't respond. She simply looked at him, her eyes the color of deep water and absolutely empty of reaction. She was still covered in Hayes's blood. Her scrubs were soaked. Blood had gotten under her fingernails, into the creases of her palms. She looked at Whitfield with all the expression of someone looking at a wall, and then she began removing her gloves with methodical precision, the latex making the distinctive sound as she peeled it away from her skin, one finger at a time. By 0600 hours, hospital administration had convened an emergency session. By 0700, they had reviewed Whitfield's incident report. By 0800, they had contacted legal counsel, who advised them that the state nursing board would certainly move forward with an investigation and likely charges. By 1000, Brooke's credentials had been flagged in the hospital system. By noon, security was walking her out of Cedar Creek Medical while Whitfield watched from the hallway near the elevators, his arms crossed, the expression on his face suggesting that he was savoring something. He called after her, his voice casual, conversational, "You should know that I've CC'd the Texas Medical Board and the district attorney on my incident report. They'll be in touch within 48 hours. Unauthorized thoracic surgery, Ms. Sullivan. That's a felony in this state." Brooke didn't break stride. She didn't look back. She walked past him the way you walk past a painting in a museum, with acknowledgement but not engagement, with the understanding that what you were looking at had nothing to do with you. But that evening, when she was home in her San Antonio house with the rain hammering the windows like applause or accusation, her 14-year-old son found her at the kitchen table in the dark, both her hands pressed flat against the wood grain, her shoulders curved inward, her breathing the only sound in the kitchen besides the water striking glass. He knew that posture. He'd seen his mother composed, confident, unbreakable. He had never seen her like this. "Mom," he said, and his voice had the fragile quality of someone asking a question he wasn't sure he wanted answered. "Why are you home early? You don't get off until 1900 hours. She couldn't answer him. She lifted one hand and pressed it against her face, and her fingers came away wet, and her son stood in the doorway understanding that something fundamental had changed, that the woman who had raised him alone, who had never shown weakness, who had kept them alive through 15 years of secrets and silence, was finally breaking. She opened her mouth to speak and nothing came out but a sound that might have been a sob or might have been something else entirely, the sound of an identity collapsing, of a legend becoming invisible again, of a Master Chief Petty Officer becoming just another unemployed nurse in a city she'd never meant to call home. He came around the table and put his arm around her shoulders, and Brooke Sullivan, who had held Marines together under chemical fire, who had just compressed a commander's heart with her bare hands, who had kept her son alive through deployments and wars and things that would never be spoken, allowed herself to be held by a child who didn't know that the woman in his arms had already been officially dead for 7 years. 2 days later, 14-year-old Marcus walked into the hospital administrator's emergency review hearing carrying a showbox. The room had gone quiet the moment he entered, administrators in pressed suits, board members checking their phones, Dr. Whitfield standing near the window with the posture of a man who'd already won. Marcus didn't look at any of them. He looked at his mother, sitting alone on a metal chair, her hands folded in her lap with the composure of someone who'd already lost everything that mattered. "Mom," Marcus said, his voice steady in a way that made his mother's chest tighten, "they need to see these." He opened the showbox. The room stopped breathing. Bronze Star. His hands pulled it free, held it up. The metal caught the fluorescent light, and something fundamental shifted in the air pressure of that room. The hospital administrator leaned forward. One board member stood. Silver Star. A second medal. Marcus's voice didn't waver. He was 14 years old and he was telling the truth about a woman nobody had believed. 2 Purple Hearts. Each one emerged like a punch, like evidence, like proof that heroism was real and it had been sitting in a supply closet for 7 years, invisible. And then the one that stopped time. And a Navy Cross. The citation came next, signed by a 3-star general named Patterson, dated 7 years prior. The words blurred together: extraordinary valor, chemical exposure, sustained tactical operation, recommendation for recognition. Nobody in that room had ever seen a Navy Cross in person. They'd seen pictures. They knew what it meant. They knew what it meant that this woman had earned one. The security guard, a Navy veteran named Clayton who'd worked Cedar Creek for 16 years, went rigid. His jaw locked. His eyes locked on the medals. "Master Chief," he said quietly. Then louder, "Master Chief on deck." It wasn't a request. It was a command, the ancient protocol of the Navy, the sound of respect made physical. Every person in that room who'd served felt it like a punch to the sternum. The ones who hadn't served felt it anyway, because that tone carries a weight that transcends understanding. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the hospital attorney spoke into her phone, and Dr. Whitfield's face went the color of old bone. 30 minutes later, the general arrived via secure video conference. Patterson, 3 stars, Joint Special Operations Command, clearance levels that made the administrator's hands shake. He looked directly at Whitfield from a screen mounted on the wall, his presence like a tank idling in a garage, all potential violence held in reserve. "You called my office 6 times, Patterson said, his voice flat as steel. "Requesting verification of military service records. When my adjutant informed you those records were classified, you claimed to have evidence of fraudulent military service claims. You asked for documentation you could provide to the medical board. Is that accurate?" Whitfield opened his mouth. Closed it. "General, I was simply trying to." "That's not what I asked." Patterson's eyes didn't blink. "Is that accurate?" "Yes, but the context." Patterson turned his head slightly, and someone off-screen handed him a folder. "You also emailed the Texas Medical Board claiming to possess military records showing dishonorable discharge. You drafted a letter to the DEA claiming Ms. Sullivan stole controlled substances during military service. You fabricated unit numbers. You fabricated dates. You created a DD-214 discharge form. 17 revisions. All saved to your office computer. The FBI agents were already walking through the door. 2 of them, badges visible, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse than a panicking doctor. They read Whitfield his rights in the same hallway where he'd mocked Brooke at the vending machine 3 weeks earlier, his voice loud enough to carry, his laughter sharp as broken glass. This time, the laughter wasn't there. There was just the sound of handcuffs clicking shut and a lawyer being called and a man whose entire architecture of power collapsing like a house built on forged documents. The charges were federal: attempted falsification of military service records, wire fraud, filing false reports with government agencies. His medical license was suspended within hours. The hospital's attorney announced his termination by afternoon. By evening, his mugshot was on every medical gossip forum in Texas, his name attached to the phrase attempted fraud. 6 months later, someone spotted Dr. Whitfield at a strip mall in northeast San Antonio, standing behind a folding table positioned between a discount shoe store and a nail salon, selling insurance policies from a company that existed primarily online. He wore a polo shirt instead of a white coat. His face had aged a decade. His hand shook slightly as he tried to explain variable annuities to people who just wanted to buy shoes. That was the world he'd entered, the one beneath the one he'd occupied, the one where nobody knew his name, where his credentials meant nothing, where a folding table and a commission-based insurance product were the only career path available to a man with a fraud conviction and a revoked medical license. Brooke returned to Cedar Creek Medical on a Monday in June, her security clearance reinstated, her personnel file officially updated to reflect her actual rank and service record, though the operational details remained classified and would remain classified for the rest of her life. The hospital had offered her a new position heading the trauma unit, a vote of confidence that came with a salary increase and an implicit apology that would never be spoken aloud but hung in every gesture of respect she received. Her office was on the 2nd floor, overlooking the trauma bays where residents rotated through shifts, still learning the things that couldn't be taught in medical school. She'd been gone for 3 weeks. It felt like years. It felt like seconds. On her desk sat a showbox. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, were a pair of worn combat boots. The leather was scuffed across both toes. The laces were frayed. There was a stain on the right heel that looked like dried blood from 7 years ago, from a bunker in Helmand Province, from 16 hours of chemical fire and a Master Chief holding a position because nobody else could. The note was in Commander Hayes's handwriting, each letter precise. Still standing, Master Chief. Brooke's hands moved slowly, the way a person touches something that might break if you're not careful. She ran her fingers across the leather, and the memory came back sharp and complete, not the heroics, not the valor, but the smaller thing, a young commander saying her name with respect, saying it like it meant something, saying it like she mattered. Her son arrived after school, pushing through the trauma unit doors with the confidence of a kid who finally understood why his mother had always been different, why she'd never quite fit into the civilian world, why she'd kept those boots on her old desk like they were sacred. "You were a Master Chief?" he asked, as if he was still trying to make it real, still trying to reconcile the woman who made him breakfast with the woman who'd earned a Navy Cross. 14 years, Brooke said. 3 deployments. 2 Purple Hearts. And you never told me. She looked at her son, then at the boots, then at the trauma unit beyond her office window where residents were already seeking her guidance on cases, already deferring to her judgment, already sensing that this woman carried authority like some people carry oxygen. "I couldn't," she said simply. It wasn't allowed. But that night, when he sat at her kitchen table and asked her why she'd kept serving, why she'd come back to nursing, why she'd saved a commander's life knowing it would cost her everything, Brooke told him something true. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. Later that week, a Marine walked into her office in dress uniform. Scar tissue visible on his neck, chemical burns, organized in the pattern of someone who'd survived what shouldn't have been survivable. Helmand Province, 7 years back, the same operation, the same fire. He saluted, his hand moving with the precision of someone who understood protocol, who understood respect, who understood that some people carry you through the worst moments of your life and you never forget it. Brooke returned the salute, and for the first time in 3 years, Master Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan stood at full attention in public, no longer invisible, no longer erased, no longer just a nurse. She was exactly what she'd always been. The world had finally caught up. If you've ever been invisible in a room full of people who couldn't see what you were, if you've ever held your silence while someone made assumptions, if you've ever known something about yourself that the world wasn't ready for, share this story. Tell someone that sometimes the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding it all together. Subscribe, like, and comment. What would you have done in Brooke's position?